Good morning, and thanks for attending the webinar. My name is Stephanie White. I'm an assistant professor here at MSU, appointed through the Department of Community Sustainability. I've got a research appointment and work for the Global Center for Food Systems Innovation, which is one of 8 development labs based at a university and is funded by the U.S. Global Development Lab at USAID. I also have a 25% appointment to the Center for Regional Food Systems, which is an organization that is devoted to the development of regionally integrated and sustainable food systems. So today's presentation is based on a chapter that is in the final editing phases, and which will be part of an edited volume published by CABI entitled Global Urban Agriculture: Convergence of Theory and Practice Between North and South. I anticipate that this is a book that will be aimed primarily at academics with an interest in some pretty esoteric subject matter. But I wanted to do a presentation that was aimed at a broader audience. So while the word theory is in the title, which I think perhaps can tend to make people think that the subject matter is going to be boring, although I'm a theory nerd, what I'm aiming to do is to show how looking through different lenses can yield a different understanding of what's going on in particular places in relation to food provisioning and exchange. In turn, that kind of understanding can lead you to different sorts of analyses and alternative judgments about what's useful or important, and therefore different decisions or recommendations. So what I'm saying here is different theoretical lenses force you to think things differently, and then can result in different sorts of solutions and in relation to where I work, different sorts of innovations. And the reason I wanted to do something that took the esoteric subject matter of the chapter and attempt to make it more broadly interesting is because, number one, food systems are relevant to every single one of us, not just academics. And number two, I think we are facing some pretty urgent challenges in our food environments and practices that we need to confront and adapt to. A lot of the current solutions I see work around the edges of how we understand food systems and attempt to to remediate them, but not really change to remedy them, but not really change the lens. They don't tend to unpack the fundamental values that underlie the food systems and which can produce or hinder improved sustainability. On this slide, you can see that I've put some double-sided arrows to indicate that our food practices have an effect on our environment, and our environment is going to have an effect on our food practices. The way that we carry out our food systems, meaning the way that we eat, the way that we grow, the way that we move our food around, and the ways that we preserve it or process it, will all have implications for the environment. In turn, what's going on in the environment is going to have an impact on what we eat, the way we grow it, the way we move our food around, and it's also going to have implications for the risks that we face. So, and right up front here, I want to say that I may be an advocate for supporting local and regional food systems, especially as it relates to small and medium-scaled entrepreneurs, but not to the exclusion of more global systems. So I think what hasn't been explored or deliberated over enough are the ways in which sustainability and resilience can work in areas of the food system beyond production. So that's what I want to talk about today. Okay, so there's wide recognition that our food systems are facing some unprecedented challenges, and usually that centers around the prediction that 9 billion people are going to be on the planet by 2050. If trajectories toward Western diets continue unabated, however, it will be equal to about 12 billion people placing demands on the food system. But in addition to that kind of intense and growing demand on the food system, there are other trends that need to be better accounted for. Kevin Morgan and Roberta Cennino call these the new food equation. First are the food price surges of 2007 and 2008, and then 2010 and 2011, which speaks to the volatility of food markets and subsequently the unrest in places where people could no longer afford food. In both of these events, the drivers were largely in relation to global food markets and distortive trade policies, as well as high energy prices. Secondly, there is ongoing broadly felt food insecurity. The FAO reports that 795 million people experience hunger worldwide, and there are many more who suffer from nutrient deficiencies. Drivers of food security occur at a range of scales, and there is no place in the world in which residents are safe from food insecurity, though the situation is much worse in some regions than in others. Though most places in the world have improved their food security situation over the last 20 years, the absolute numbers of people experiencing food insecurity in sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia have increased. The percentages have gone down, the percentages of people who experience food insecurity, but because of population growth, the absolute numbers have gone up. And many of the places that experience food insecurity, is not surprising, also experience economic and social instability as well. Third, though many regions have experienced improvements in food security, the threat of food insecurity due to food system volatility is never far away. For example, many of the countries that are reported to be more food secure over the last 20 years, including middle-income countries, were the sites of protests when food prices spiked in 2008 and 2010. At high policy levels, policymakers realize that food can have an impact on national security, and they're starting to frame things that way. Fourth, climate change is likely to exacerbate volatility in the food system and will have effects all along the supply chain. Most often we hear about that in relation to production environments, and a lot of the solutions are going towards climate resilient sorts of seed stocks, but it's also going to have implications for transportation, infrastructure, for energy required, the energy along the food system, storage pests, and things like that. And of course, food systems have an implication for emissions. Fifth, in several parts of the world, namely Africa and Asia, there are changing land dynamics which are changing the opportunities for people to earn incomes, and they're compelling people to change their livelihood strategies. Moreover, unsustainable development is causing pressure on natural resources such as water and soil erosion. And I'm actually going to add a sixth factor, which Morgan and Cennino allude to, but don't directly name it as a factor, but it dovetails with the last point. The changing land dynamics are often creating situations where people are moving to urban places. And so the cities don't necessarily offer better economic opportunities, but people are often trying to escape rural poverty. In addition, cities are growing just because of natural population growth. So those sorts of broad changes are causing changes in the food system as well. And it also compels us to think about nutrition and food insecurity in more citified ways. These trends are social, political, and environmental. They suggest we are in a new territory that demands new ways of understanding and organizing food systems. Volatility and uncertainty are key themes. And understanding the complexity and the unprecedented set of challenges here means that evolving food system policy and practices need some fundamental rethinking. Okay, so in the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to focus on how I made use of resilience theory to explain urban agriculture in the context of an urban food system in Senegal. First, I'll make my case for why new conceptual frames are necessary for responding to this new food equation. And then I'll talk about how resilience is one useful frame for thinking. And then I'll move into my research, which is more practical in nature. So, and I'll talk about my findings then. So why local? In the first few slides, I presented the macro global framing as it relates to trends in the food systems, and that's what seems to get a lot of talk when you're talking about the different challenges facing food systems, and that you just tend to hear things presented in terms of a macro or global level. There is wide recognition of the trends that I mentioned. And you hear a lot of people talking about the need for food systems to become more sustainable and resilient. But my basic argument today is that if you want increased resilience, you need to start perceiving the food system now in relation to resilience, in relation to indicators that talk about resilience, that focus on resilience. And the idea there is that what gets measured gets managed. Once you have your eyes on the problem, it's only then that you can start managing things. So from here on out, I'm going to drill down to the local, which in this case is in Bour, Senegal, which is where I conducted dissertation research. So often the focus is on, this is back in, I collected my research in 2010 to 2011 and finished up that research in 2014. So often the focus is what's going on at the macro level. And very often what's happening at a local level is only interpreted or used in relation to how it confirms the macro story. The underlying conviction of my research approach is that local is important, and that studying the local can, one, help to better explain and inform the macro, not just confirm it, but also to challenge mainstream explanations. Number two, reveal diversity in food practices that can be instructional in other contexts. And number three, reveal local conditions, constraints, opportunities that will be helpful for supporting practices in that particular place. In addition, the reality is that local modes of food exchange, which employ thousands of people, rural and urban individuals, often women, are going to be extremely important for the foreseeable future. This graphic appears in a paper written by my colleague at Michigan State University. Thank you. And what it tells us is that the traditional sector, the purple area in these graphs, fulfills 85 to 95% of the market demand, while the modern sector, which means supermarkets, responds to only 10%. By 2040, under the best of conditions for modern sector growth, the projection here is that the traditional or informal sector will still be responsible for responding to 60 to 70% of market demand. So in terms of feeding urban populations, the so-called traditional sector is extremely important, though its importance will vary in different places and for different segments of the population. Okay, so before discussing why resilience can be a useful frame for understanding these food systems, which I'm saying are going to be so important, I want to briefly criticize the concepts of traditional and informal in talking about these food systems, because I think it provides a rationale for changing our frames for thinking about them. I think the way that they're perceived now with those words and those concepts tends to stifle creative thinking about those systems and building from those systems. So the traditional sector, which I just used in the last slide, is also referred to as the informal sector. Those words, informal and traditional, bring with them certain judgments about the quality or value of that part of the food system. The word informal actually has a long and storied history, which I'm not going to go into here, except to say that it was a term that was created in the 1970s to draw attention to economic activities that occurred outside the formal or regulated sector of the economy. It's also now come to be conflated with, and also to just describe small scale and individualized economic activities. At the same time, in addition just to describing scale, there's also a bunch of qualitative assumptions that are attached to those terms. And they tend to create certain assumptions about those food practices. For the most part, informal systems have been understood to be antiquated, dilapidated, and insufficient for moving food around. And they have also been interpreted to be unable and unequipped to meet the demands of growing urban populations, which are projected to have more income to spend. There are a number of implications of such a conceptual lens. Most importantly, such an orientation gives the impression that food exchange and provisioning should look a certain way, that it should look a developed way or a modern way, with wage labor, consolidated food chains, and relationships that encourage an accumulation of capital. In addition, the assumption here is that the informal sector has a present but no future, and that food provisioning and exchange will eventually and naturally just evolve into these modern systems. But what my point is here is that it's important to understand what the value of these systems is and how they are important to food security and how people are using them right now for food security. And for that, you need a conceptual lens that allows you to see that value. It's important to see these practices in ways other than an informal or traditional / modern dichotomy. And here, I just want to present you with something that you may be more familiar with, which is a gender analysis. For those of you familiar with gender analysis, you know that when you start to ask questions about male and female roles in society, you begin to get a more granular and profound understanding of how society works. Who values what, how decisions are made, what interests are served by what institutions and what practices. If you don't ask those questions and seek out those answers, very often society can seem less complex and more cohesive than it actually is. The same is true of food systems with respect to the conceptual frames that you use. So Ray Bromley, who worked early in his career in urban markets in Cali, Colombia, which sort of just one of my keystone authors that I refer to in thinking about these issues. He's still working at SUNY. He put it this way in his introduction to a 1978 edition of World Development on alternatives to the conceptual frames of informality. What he's saying is that informality, the term and the concept, provided the rationale for the sorts of policies which the mainstream development community wished to recommend to third world countries. In other words, it embodied policy implications which were convenient for international organizations and politically middle-of-the-road governments, and it appeared to help the poor without any major threat to the rich. I understand the rationale for using the word informal because it distinguishes it from the formal regulated sector of the economy, but I also think that using it as a development shorthand has a way of obscuring a whole bunch of information that could otherwise be important for decision making in practice. Okay. So all of this is just to say that the lens you use to understand reality has real world implications. The saying that you used to hear, which you don't hear so much anymore, is that to solve some problems you need out of the box thinking. Well, it's not really another out of the box that you're seeking, it's another box. And another pithy way of conveying this idea is that the map is not the territory, and different maps give you different ideas about what's happening in the territory. You always use abstractions to understand what's going on in the world, but the world can look very different depending on the abstractions that you use. So what are some of the characteristics of food exchange and provisioning systems in regional and local food systems? Acknowledging those can help us to revise our modes of abstraction. So here's just a couple of things that I've written down. And those of you who have worked in places that have what would be termed as informal food systems are familiar with these. Food exchange and provisioning is highly decentralized and occurs at multiple scales, meaning from very small scale to larger scale. Food in any small spatial area has multiple stages of processing, from live animals and live plants to the finished product on your plate. People use diverse methods in food exchange and provisioning, both market and non-market sources. The strategies that people use are contingent, meaning that different people, depending upon their particular risks and vulnerabilities and the opportunities and constraints available to them, will use different strategies for accessing food. Very often people are purchasing food on a daily basis, either for lack of income or for lack of refrigeration or both. Food exchange in cities is heavily comprised of women. Urban food systems are emergent and organic, meaning they've developed along with the city. They've developed as the city develops, and in many ways you could think of them as actually constituting the city. They're organic because they're popularly produced, and when I say organic here, I just mean they've just sort of evolved, same thing as emergent. And they're carried out by large numbers of urban citizens. So I'm moving into the research itself, and I'll show you how I used resilience theory to understand what was happening in a way that took into account those kinds of practices and looked to see how they were meaningful in relation to people's food security strategies. The presentation, as I mentioned, the presentation I'm doing is from research that I did for my dissertation. I lived in Mbour, Senegal from August of 2010 to May 2011, and then finished writing in early 2014. In that research, I wanted to look at urban agriculture in a way that was more relevant to the people living in the city, and how they used multiple forms of dry season urban farming and gardening. I looked at it in 3 different ways, which are outlined there on that side. In a way, what it did was to use one widespread livelihood as an entry point into multiple ways of understanding the city. I'm presenting a variation of the 3rd chapter there, the 3rd paper, which was producing food resiliencies, and that's the one that will be in the book. What distinguishes it from many other studies of urban agriculture is that the primary focus was really on the meaning of urban agriculture in relation to how people were using it. Very often, studies of urban agriculture just focus on the material output, and so that leads to a discussion about, well, the material output is important, or the material output is not important. And I think that's not necessarily a very useful road to go down, because it's going to vary from place to place and from person to person and over time. So I just really wanted to understand how it was used in relation to the experiences of people in the city. As I said, I was in Mbour, Senegal, which was a wonderful place to be. I was there for 9.5 months, and Mbour is an ethnically diverse coastal town of about 200,000 people, located 80 kilometers south of Dakar. I was also a Peace Corps volunteer there in the 90s, so speak the language pretty well. Mbour is a rapidly growing town, and officials estimate that about 60% of the population were not born there. This is a little hard to see with this. It gives you, it gives you a pretty good idea of how the city has grown over a period of 1 decade. The one on the left is Mbour in 2003. And the one on the right is 2013, and you can see the growth around the edges and even filled in from the left side to the right side. So it's really done a lot of growing in a decade. The main income generating activities, according to the mayor's office, are fishing, tourism, and petty commerce. Mbour is a really vibrant town. There's lots of activities in the streets and markets, and sufficient and diverse kinds of food are easily accessed if one has the means to purchase them. But during the time we were there, residents commonly remarked upon the cost of living increases and how expensive food had become and how expensive other material necessities had become. It's also quite a variable and uncertain environment. While we were there, we experienced daily power outages. I think we went over the period of 9.5 months, we went 3 days without one interruption. Daily water outages, petrol and cooking gas shortages and price increases, and severely depleted fish stocks. And all of those things, the picture on the right here is people lining up to buy gas once it came back into town, but we were without it for days and days. Such occurrences have causal factors at multiple scales. So while it's a vibrant and thriving place, there's a lot of uncertainty that people are confronted with. It's just a daily reality of their lives. So the idea that people are navigating uncertainty is something that really helps to understand the role of urban agriculture and other food practices. You'll remember back to the beginning of this presentation where I talked about how the new food equation is some common themes there are volatility and uncertainty. So there are many people around the world who experience this kind of volatility and uncertainty now and have been experiencing it their whole lives as it relates to food provisioning. So it's likely that understanding some of the practices that people are using can help to inform our understanding of volatility and uncertainty and how relationships and practices, not just production, not just food production, can help to navigate those kinds of daily realities. So specifically, my research looked at urban agriculture and how it integrates with the city, and what I wanted to understand it was as a social and urban process. I didn't want to understand it as a rural practice misplaced in an urban environment. I wanted to understand it as people were using it in the city, in city food environments. I recognize from Kathy Charmez says that focusing on a basic social process can help gain a more complete picture of the whole setting, and that's how I sort of used it. I viewed urban agriculture as an entry point into the wider food provisioning system of Mbur. So very often, as I said, that urban agriculture is studied in relation to the material output and in isolation, meaning from field to field in a city environment. And it just leads to a body of literature that is either celebratory on the one side or critical on the other side. So as I said, I just wanted to understand it in terms of food practices. The movement of food anywhere relies on relationships. It just depends on what scale the relationships are, what the bodies of, what individuals or bodies or groups are creating those relationships. To understand how it works, you need to look very closely at those relationships and what's valued there. In much of Africa, for example, systems of food provisioning and exchange are highly decentralized and emergent. And when I started to think about what was going on, when I started to look at it, trying to understand it from a grounded perspective, I used to call them in-your-face food systems, because food is literally everywhere. Although it's differentially available, it's always in various stages of processing. Food wanders the street, like that sheep right there. It's in the trunks of cars. It's you see bunches of, or I don't know what a group of chickens is called, like a herd of chickens in the back of a taxi. On the tops of buses in the form of live goats, chickens, and pigs. People carry around various kinds of food to sell, and food is grown in the in-between spaces of cities. It's being processed everywhere from the streets and in the households. So in my study, as I went along, it became apparent to me that urban agriculture was only one practice in a larger food provisioning system. Looking at it in isolation really didn't give a good picture of how it was meaningful in the food system and in relation to the challenges and opportunities that people face. In my analysis, I was looking for conceptual frames that could help me to better understand how urban agriculture was meaningful, and resilience theory, because it deals with socioecological systems, provided a natural fit. Often when you hear about resilience today, it's talked mainly as a goal to be reached, or a quality that can be taught or imparted to especially farmers in farming systems. But the theory of resilience states that resilience is a system property. So resilience theory comes out of the field of ecology. In particular, Holling's 1973 paper on resilience noted that systems can experience a wide range of fluctuations or disturbance, but they still are working to retain the same functions and identity. Since that paper, the concept of resilience has been applied to a wide range of coupled social and ecological systems. One thing to note is that a resilient system can either be a desirable or undesirable system. And I know that it's very often used today in positive terms. It's very often used alongside of sustainable, and maybe sustainable helps to qualify it. But resilience as a system property is neither good nor bad. A recent paper by Jennifer Hodbod and Hallie Eakin discuss this, and then they make the point that if you are going to apply it to food systems, that you just have to, there has to be some normative value associated, because food security is a normative outcome. It's something you can't really aim for a resilient food system that doesn't produce food security. So you have to adopt that normative outcome. Key to the understanding of resilience is adaptive capacity, which is what my chapter mainly focuses on. In short, I interpreted urban agriculture as one adaptive food practice among many that improves adaptive capacity in the food system. Resilience refers to the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing changes, so it still retains essentially the same functions, structure, and identity and feedbacks. The adaptive practice in a food system would mainly be carried out by the people, and that's what I focused on. It would be, so what I'm trying to understand here is adaptive practice and how it leads to food security, how people adapt their food practices to ensure food security. Depending on how people experience vulnerability in the system, they will employ different adaptive practices. The system provides a lot of entry points for employing those varying adaptive practices. It's commonly suggested in both academic literature and by municipal officials that urban agriculture represents a backwards or rural use of urban space, but conceptualized as a method of building resilience, you just will see it as one more adaptive practice. You can sort of dispense with that urban-rural dichotomy in relation to, in relation to valuing food practices, but just look at it as one more adaptive practice that increases food access around the city. There are some principles that are identified in the resilience literature that are generally recognized to enhance the ability to deal with perturbations and incorporate change. And so that's how I use those principles to interpret my findings. I'm only going to go through a couple of them. So just so you can get an idea how resilience theory can help to see food systems in different ways and challenge conventional understandings. So a key point to keep in mind was that in this city, I looked, and I've been alluding to this, I just haven't used this next word. I've been looking at as a buffer in the food provisioning system in the face of uncertainty, and as a way of protecting against failures in or shock to other components of the system. In the resilience literature, this is called redundancy. The variability in food sourcing provides a backup if one food source fails. And then the people themselves are exhibiting response diversity, because any household is likely to use multiple and critical paths to access food. Urban food systems in the Global South have typically emerged in relation to highly variable and chronically uncertain food environments with very minimal centralized municipal management or support. In such conditions, it's unsurprising that people would evolve multiple pathways to ensure food access, and that they would maintain a variety of food practices from which to draw, even if each specific food practice only gives a very small share. In other words, having multiple sources of food is an adaptive practice that increases resiliency in the social, economic, and environmental context of the city. Diversity helps to buffer the system by spreading risk and addressing critical points of instability. And two ways that urban agriculture diversifies the systems are discussed here. One is with income diversity and with agroecosystem diversity, and then also food access. And you'll note here that I'm actually calling the urban food system an agroecosystem. That term is usually reserved for rural environments, but in many cities throughout the world, urban primary production is common in terms of growing food, in terms of like chickens, sheep, pigs, there's so much so, and there's so many nutrients recycled in maintaining primary production that you can almost think of cities as an integrated farm with multiple farmers, helping to understand how productive resources are cycled and then how people draw on those resources in the production and exchange of food. A farm is integrated, and I use the term integrated, when with the outputs of one productive activity, for example, manure, manure from raising chickens or goats or whatever, are used as the inputs for another, as they are in Mbor. Urban farmers will often use manure, which I'll talk about in a second. And when crops and livestock production is carried out via complementary practices. So as farmers diversified their income sources, they also diversified the urban agrosystem, which represents spatial heterogeneity. As Francis Owusu, who is an urban planning professor at University of Iowa or Iowa State, he's found in his study on urban livelihood that people in African cities typically find several different income streams to make ends meet, which he refers to as multiple modes of livelihood. In Mbor, among the farmers I interviewed, urban agriculture was typically viewed as a pragmatic secondary or tertiary way to earn money that fit well with the city and with the circumstances that people experience. None of the farmers in my study grew just one crop, and several of them diversified by planting both annuals and perennials, also which represents, those are called polycultures, and it represents both spatial and temporal heterogeneity. Polycultures are generally recognized to improve resilience, not only for the diverse products and sources of income, but because the diversity in that system works against like micro perturbations, micro disruptions in the system. And also you can efficiently use space, vertical space and horizontal space. In addition, farmers maintained flexibility and a high degree of connectedness with various buyers. Such a system in which there are many connections among a high number of individuals. People are free to make connections with as many people as they can. This is called appropriate connectedness in the resilience literature, which in practice means that people are collaborating with multiple suppliers and multiple outlets, including consumers, rather than just sticking with one consumer, which is often, I guess, would be seen in a modern food system to be against a practice of efficiency, but it's a way of increasing resilience. Okay, this next graphic this is not reporting any empirical data whatsoever. I was just trying to show how the city, as the city expands, so do the points of food access. You could see city growth as being a disruption to the food environment. So the city is constantly undergoing, and the food system is constantly going under minor disruptions that people have to adjust to and accommodate as the food system grows along with the city. So as new people arrive in Mbor, even temporarily, what these would be called in the resilience literature are points of instability are created, or disturbances. So in doing so, the food system is forced to create new networks and new relationships, and at the same time, people are bringing in new knowledge to the food system, which represents a sort of replenishment of the system. In addition, in Mbor, there's one central market that services the entire town, and the town itself is spread over 22 square kilometers. But because most people must provision their households on a daily basis, that one market is really inconvenient, and it represents just a huge burden for people. So having people sort of different kinds of food access points around the cities helps to deal with the location of that one central market. A major quality of resilient system is that the system functions as much as possible within the means of the bioregionally available natural resource base and ecosystem services. In many African cities, as I said, urban primary production is common, so much so that thinking of the city as an integrated farm, as I'd said, is something that people do. And so in Mbur, farmers depend heavily on the natural resources of the agroecosystem. Soils in Mbur are very poor, composed mainly of sand, and they have little nutrient or water holding capacity. And so to make them productive, farmers need to amend the soils with lots of organic matter, which they do either through the addition of manures. People had lots of different commentary on different kinds of manures they used in what circumstances, what was good for what they would use when they needed like a quick nitrogen boost. They would use chicken manure. For more long-term, slow-release horse manure. So, and then also compost from the city dumps was used by farmers and gardeners. Two of the farmers in my study also used fish waste, which, being a coastal city, is a plentiful resource, but underutilized. And then, so I'm going to be concluding here in just a second. The limits, it's not all rosy, and of course you have to look at what the limits to adaptive capacity are too. I identified a few areas where resilience of the food system could be strengthened. Among them, profit margins are often too small for farmers, and which is saying a lot, because profit margins for most people engaged in small-scale food-based livelihoods is small. Profit margins are just small overall. The opportunities to build knowledge or human capital among farmers was also low, as were opportunities for farmers to share their own knowledge. Farmers, you would think that farmers would talk to each other and share knowledge, and to the extent that they could, they did, but as a city that's spread out over 22 square kilometers, a lot of farmers, even though, they were providing a service in their neighborhoods, but they were isolated from each other. There was an inability to connect with other farmers because of their distance from each other. And there's also a lack, of course, of extension services. I've not heard of any extension services that help urban farmers. Beyond the scientific expertise that extension offers, extension services could potentially act as a hub under which farmers could gather, but there was nothing of the sort there. So also structural and policy issues can intervene in ways that can't be overcome through food practices and relationships. One farmer, for example, used to be able to farm millet around her household, and at one point in 2006, the municipality came out and told her that she could no longer do that, and they were saying that was because of a threat of mosquitoes and malaria. In some cases, the newness of a person can affect their ability to connect with other people. Spatial location can also prevent people from accessing demand. And so in all of those, you can see where there might be opportunities for additional support or working with people to come up with a system where they might network better. And I'm just going to finish this, pretty much the last slide. Finish with this quote. When analyzing resilience, it makes sense to address the local level and build linkages to other scales. Resilience thinking helps the researcher to look beyond the static analysis of social systems and ecological systems, and to ask instead questions regarding the adaptive capacity of societies and their institutions. So what I've presented today is from a qualitative study based on interviews and observations with urban cultivators over a 9.5-month period. The findings draw attention to a range of practices and relationships that people employ to navigate the city, to provision their households, as well as to earn income. And it's intended to draw attention to food systems that are often obscured through the language that we use, such as informal or traditional. Thanks very much for attending, and we can now feel free to ask questions or offer your observations about the research.
Thanks, Stephanie. We have some questions that have come in already, but please feel free to submit them through the Q&A box.
Okay. So just answer that now? Okay. Okay, so the 2040 stats, what the projection is that in 2040, although, okay, and this is just a projection. So although the traditional sector, the sector of the economy that is highly individualized and emergent, it will be, the modern sector in some ways takes over some of that demand, but there's still 60 to 70% of the city demand will be fulfilled by that sector. Does that answer the question? Okay, now we're moving to this next one. Karen Timmerman, did you choose Senegal because you had previous experience there and noticed urban ag practices? Is it a good microcosm? I chose Senegal because I knew it well, and because I knew that I could speak the language and get to the kind of deep understanding that I wanted to get for my dissertation. And I don't know that it's a good microcosm. From what I know about urban agriculture is that it's very different wherever it's practiced, and food systems are going to be they're going to be varied from wherever. I think that the method is what I was focused on, and the use of resilience theory for seeing things differently. So whether or not it's a good microcosm, I don't know about that. I think I would not venture to say that it is. And then, how do you feel about suburban policy that makes it impossible to create homesteads? Can policy dictate how we use space that we own? Well, for me, thinking about how I want to use my front lawn and my neighbors not being so happy about how I want to use my front lawn to grow food, it's something that I think people just need to confront and deal with, and recognize that policy can change over time. In cities in the global south, a lot of times the space in suburban and urban policy, there are lots of contentions over space. It's contested. Using urban space is contested. So, and from what I have seen going forward, and what urban planning, like African urban planning professionals are saying, is that it really needs you need a really participatory and collaborative approach to the use of urban space. So, I mean, I think policy can be a powerful thing. I just think that it also needs to be through democratic means. Okay, I am new to resilience, but I wonder how important bartering is as a coping mechanism. I think that kind of stuff, it happens. In Senegal, I think that it happens a lot, but I don't think you're going to draw attention to it as necessarily an intentional practice, like an item for an item. I think that people are often giving away things in lieu of money, and to increase, that's actually something I talk about in the paper, for people to increase or to maintain their social relationships. They often give away things. But I think it's, I'm sure it's used as a coping mechanism. I probably can't give you a more precise answer than that.